Ever hear of a fuel that would dissolve the pilot? Yeah, they used it in the Me163 Comet. It's called T-Stop. And I'm pretty sure that's what the Wicked Witch got dosed with by Dorothy. It wasn't water, it was T-Stop. Hey everybody, welcome back to Trey's Models, and Happy New Year. This is our first build of the new year. We're going to be doing the Meng 1/32 scale Comet. And as usual, these aircraft builds start off in the office. This kit's unique. It gives you kind of an option with the instrument panel. You get a photo etch option and just a straight up plastic molded one. So in the interest of seeing how both of them would look side by side on this build, I'm actually going to go ahead and do both and see what we got. Here we're cutting the photo etch off of the runner that it's on. I use a piece of tile and a straight razor, and then a nice file. Come back, deburr the sides, get everything nice and cleaned up, get it ready for some primer so that the paint will stick to it, and off we go. And once I got the instrument panel painted, I needed to establish where the decals were going to go in between the laminations. So to do that, I used some black paint. It's a water-based acrylic, and I just dipped the metal part into that and gently set it down on the face of the instrument panel, and that gave me a location for the decals to go to. I'm prepping the seat belts from the photo etch. I like to use a Tamiya 800 grit sanding sponge wet and go lightly over it. Try not to snag the details, get it all scuffed up for paint. Back to the instrument panel, and going through the paint and putting on each individual gauge after I'd marked where they're supposed to be at, and frustrating with some surface tension, but I finally got it. So I got started on the photo etch, now I'm getting started on the all plastic. Continuing on with the instrument panel, got the center set of gauges done. Now I have to put the face plate over the top of the completed center set of gauges and secure that with some PVA glue. Some of the instrument bezels have a colored ring around the outside of them. To accomplish that, I just use some enamel paint with a rubberized brush tip. Dip it in the paint and then just dip it in the hole very gently, just enough to get the paint coated around the outside of the bezel. Continuing on with the photo etch portion of the instrument panel, I have to put the gauge faces on them. It's a layer that goes actually over the instruments, and it's use some simple clear Elmer's glue for this. Works really well without making a big mess, and if I goof up, I can clean it up with water. Makes it real simple, and it gives it a good tight bond. With both photo etch and the straight up plastic instrument panels finished, what I like to do is come back with a little AK landing gear wash, do a little pin wash around the bezels. This helps pop out the detail a little bit. On this aircraft with the bigger windscreen, you will be able to see in there and actually get to see some of this instrument panel details, so it's worth taking the time to do this little extra step because it will show. With the pin wash complete on the instrument panels, I did come back with a blue dye and marked the oxygen actual gauge because it does have like a blue ring around it. Then I moved on to the rest of the interior pieces. Got the seat belts painted with an off-white, almost a tan color. Came back and did a wash on the rest of the side panels, and the seat I basically just painted RLM 66 along with everything else, and then detailed that and a blue oxygen hose on one side, and that was a basic wrap on the instrument panel and the cockpit area. And the seat belt's complete, and the backing plate where the headrest goes painted up. Painted the headrest a darker brown, it's like a leather. With the help of a rubber-tipped pen, more like a paintbrush with a rubber tip on it, and some angled tweezers, I was able to manipulate the lap belt in place. The shoulder belts went on pretty easy without much fuss. Lap belts, on the other hand, getting them to come around that curve on the armor plate of the bottom seat, a little bit more of a challenge, and every time I bent it into place where I thought it needed to be, it wanted to move on me. So I had to come back and relocate it a couple times, manipulate it into place, but eventually I got to lay down where I wanted it, and it looks pretty authentic. The next step up was assembling the rest of the cockpit. which involved putting on the sidewalls, getting the seat mounted up. A little bit of struggle getting the instrument panel to fit up in the front. Had to kind of spread it apart, hold it in place while the glue set, and then manipulate the instrument panel into place on top of that. But if you take your time, a little patience pays off. It does go together, and it fits really well. All that part of the assembly went together, and that was basically the module of the office was complete and ready to install inside the fuselage halves. Moving on to the fuel tank and the rocket engine. The plumbing that comes with the kit is a little difficult to work with, and it doesn't make the bends correctly around some of the components internally. So I wound up using some soft wire, which was easier to manipulate and looked more scale. It wasn't quite as thick. I think it looked better. It was a lot easier to work with, to manipulate around and get it glued into place. I used a flexible CA to do that. The tank itself has a really bad seam that you need to deal with. I used some needle files, sand this, keeping in mind not to lose any of the detail on the sides. I was very careful about running the needle files alongside those straps. In the long run, later on in the build, I found out this was kind of redundant. You can't see this part of the tank. It sits so far down in the fuselage when the halves are glued together that you could actually forgo this pain and just glue it together. You won't see it in the long run. And again, more cleanup on the tank. I'm using an 800 grit Tamiya sanding sponge here. Clean up the ends. Probably don't need to do this either, because this is very hard to see once the fuselage halves are glued together. So this is another point where you could probably forgo this part and be okay. The fuel tank sorted, moved on to the rocket engine, got all that basically built up with the plumbing run, and the fuselage pods ready to go in. The back half of the rocket with the burner can is ready to be assembled. One thing I forgot to mention, the instrument panel, the gauges got a drop of floor polish on top of each gauge face to give it that clear lens look. We got the skid plate for the landing gear. This would retract after the wheels had been jettisoned, and then before landing would be put back in the down position. The plate itself is a two-piece. It does require a little bit of trimming and a little bit of fine sanding to get the top plate to fit down into the bottom plate. But a little bit of sanding, a little attention to detail, goes together fairly well. And then, of course, a little Tamiya thin cement. Glue that back all together, and you're on and ready for the bracing part of it. So after I got the two halves cemented together, you get a little clothespin and some tweezers clamped together until the glue set completely, and then it was on to the bracing. Okay, the main skid bracing is where I ran into one of the first parts of this kit that I'm really not pleased with. The bracing arms themselves are split down the middle. I don't know why you would want to do it this way. It certainly makes for difficult cleanup, to say the least, and the assembly is kind of fiddly. I wasn't 100% pleased with the way this came out. Fortunately, it's on the bottom in between the fuse and the skid plate, and once it's all painted, it's really kind of hard to see. But this could have been done so much better. Meng really dropped the ball here, in my opinion, on this particular part of the assembly. Getting it to line up, then getting everything to properly fit was really a challenge. And like I said, after everything was glued, you have to come back with some needle files and clean up those seams. But made it work in the end. Before I get too much further and I forget, I wanted to show a comparison of the actual photo etch instrument panel and just the solid plastic one that came with the kit. And you see the photo etch one installed in the cockpit tub versus the completely plastic molded one. They're not too far removed from the being close together, but there is a definite improvement over the plastic one on the photo etch of mine. Back to the main skid, the side plate is glued on with the braces being in the middle. They kind of interlock. Once you get one established, then you just glue on the other side. It's pretty straightforward. And at this point, you pretty much got the fiddly parts done. It's just a matter of getting the main assembly together. And it goes together pretty well without any major issues. And then, of course, the main axle goes on. And once you get that in place, then the skid assembly is ready to install. I actually held off. I skipped the sequence in the manual. I didn't put this on until after the fuse was completely glued together and painted. I actually stuck this in there pretty much right at the tail end of the build, just because I didn't want it to be in the way while I was, and it was one more thing you would have had to mast off. So that was another reason why I left it off. And it slides in from the back once you get the fuselage halves together pretty well, so it's not an issue leaving it off at this point. The instruction would have you put it together as the fuselage halves together, but you really don't have to do it that way. So at this point, all the basic sub-assemblies are pretty much done, except the tail unit, of course. And the cockpit tub, the fuselage halves, and right below the cockpit tub, you'll see that little gray fillet that goes up into the fuselage half where the wing root would fit. That's going to come into play later with the fit issue. So pay close attention to that. We're going to be discussing how to work around on that one. And some more fiddly bits were added to the rocket engine. This is a basic dry fit up of the major components, with the exception of the wing attachment points inside the fuselage. There's 4 tabs that glue to the inside of the fuse that hold this piece in, that later on the wing will attach to. This is where I had the beginnings of a problem, and it took a while for me to trace it back to this point. That's why I'm showing it kind of out of sequence here, because this is pretty important. I had to literally split the fuselage back apart and cut these attachment points loose in 2 locations to get the wings to sit into the bevel that they fit into in the side of the fuselage. I don't know if I didn't quite get them in the right place or if they're just molded wrong. I couldn't figure it out, but it was a fix later on. The rocket engine assembled and painted, I basically used a mix of Testor's aluminum, some brass, and some copper, and blended the colors on the aft burner can and in the middle section. And then with some Tamiya clear orange, came and thinned that really thin, and just did a light dusting on the very back of it, kind of break up the monochromatic copper look that it had going on back there. And the rest of it was just silver. And then it came back and highlighted some of the engine components. Okay, so we got a random onto the main wings. These are very nicely molded. The detail on them is really nice. One thing you do have to watch for on this Meng kit, the runner attachments to the actual part are kind of in a pain to clean up spot. There's some at the very root of the wing to where it would mate up with the fuse, and you've got to be very careful about cleaning it up because it's right close to the edge detail. I used a needle file and just went kind of slow. It takes a while, but you can get it done without damaging the outer part of it, because if you tear up the outside of it getting that part cleaned up, you will see it. You'll have to fill it later. As it turns out, a lot of filler was required in this area when the fuselage halves were together and the wings mated to it, so kind of goes without saying you're going to run into that anyway. Along the flap and aileron parts of the wing, there's also a runner gate there that is like in a really prominent spot that you have to make sure you get those flattened out. Just keep sanding a little bit at a time and test fitting, and you'll get it. Now, once you get everything cleaned up and you go to put these wing halves together, mine had one that was, one half of it was a little warped, but that's no big deal. I just started gluing at one end and worked my way out and clamped it as I went. Just be patient, take a little time. If you get them glued straight, you won't have issues later on with that particular part of it. Okay, once the glue is set up on the wing halves, it's time to come back and start cleaning things up, sanding the seam lines. One close attention to detail was near the gun port area. That's probably the ugliest part of the seams between the two wing halves. Took some 800 grit and then worked that and tried to stay away from the exposed areas of the detail around the gun port so that as not to disturb that, because that'd be kind of difficult to reestablish. Also step that back down to 800 grit for the final, but basically just go around the leading edge, clean everything up as best you can. One area you really won't have to worry too much about is where that leading edge slat goes in. You really won't see that once that slat is in place, and you will need a little bit of cleanup there later on in the build where the slat actually attaches to it. Okay, now here's where things got really ugly. Went to made up the tail to the fuse, and there are some really ugly gaps here. This is just beyond my guess as to how they let this get through quality control. This isn't even close to being a fit, and it is not even going to be close to fun to try to fix. First, to tackle the biggest main gap, I have this old Star Trek base stand that happened to be the right thickness for that particular area. Already had a curve. Two things killed with one stone, and I didn't have to cut the inner parts, which would have been a major pain. And so also use some 1mm evergreen stock, square stock, and cut that down for the little tiny gap in between the little fillet on the tail to the trailing edge root. On the tail unit, there's a fillet that fits in, that slots into the trailing edge of the wing, and there's also a pretty gnarly gap there. It's not as bad as the rest of it, but it still needs to be dealt with. For this, I used some Perfect Plastic. It's a water-based putty, and some low-tack masking tape placed right on the edge of where the gap is. Apply the Perfect Plastic. You can spread it with your finger, wet it a little bit, get it smoothed out. After you get it applied, you can come back with the wet cotton swab and clean up the excess. Pull the tape, let it set for a second. Just a damp Q-tip will clean the rest of it up. The sanding will be at a minimum. I like the stuff and this application a lot better than using a thinner based putty, which attacks the plastic a little bit and it's a little harder to work with. This stuff works really good. It doesn't seem to shrink up after you get it on, so you don't have to worry about that later on, but I still prime it regardless. More fit issues that had to be dealt with some small shims from evergreen sheet plastic. There just wasn't any getting around it. I had to keep adding more here and there as I test fit, dry fit. One of the bigger issues came when it was time to fit the wing to the actual fuselage. There was a major fit issue. I could not for the life of me, no matter how many times I dry fitted and sanded, get everything to line back up. I actually wound up popping the fuselage back a half, separating the two halves and going inside where that inner fillet that I showed you earlier in the build was at, and cutting away two of the attachment points. That helped. I then came back, taped off the edges, sanded everything down as best I could without destroying too much detail. Again, using the masking tape to protect those areas. I then came back to the Perfect Plastic and did the same procedure that I did with the tail section, only going around the wing root to fuselage area, building up the Perfect Plastic. Once it had kind of gelled and set up a little bit, wet it, smoothed it, then while it's still wet, pull the tape. If you wait till it dries, sometimes you take a risk of pulling a big chunk off. So definitely pull the tape away while it's still a little soft. Once that tape's away, you can come back again and clean up even further with the wet Q-tip. This helps a lot in maintaining a lot of the detail, so you don't wind up spending hours rescribing and reestablishing rivet lines. Just slow, patient, and steady. Keep checking the work, keep test fitting, and eventually you'll get to a point where, at least I did, where I could live with it. This was definitely a struggle with this issue of the fit. Okay, once I gave the perfect plastic time to dry, I got out some 800 wet dry and painted the areas with the perfect plastic with some RLM 66 Model Master enamel. Let that cure out. That seems to help seal down that water-based putty and gives it kind of a protective cover and gives you something to sand to. Also, it helps where you're sanding, you can actually see the material you're cutting away, so that you know you got a nice, clean, smooth surface. And some more wet sanding up on the front fuselage area. Get everything else all cleaned up here. Get it as smoothed out as possible without killing the detail. Making sure that the putty and everything is all lined and a good smooth transition across. And then finally test fit the tail section to make sure everything lined up correctly, and it looks like it at this point it's looking a lot better. Onto the upper hatches. Did have a little bit of an issue here because I wanted to leave the aft deck out so that you could see the top of the rocket assembled engine without anything being in the way. So that meant I had to shim up that aft hatch to get the alignment proper, and also there had to be a shim added to the back half of it as well to take up a gap that I think is a continuation of the issues from the other assemblies. Use some thin evergreen, tack glued it in place at the top of the curve, and then just as the glue melted it, I was able to curve it around and get that back half completely matched up to the curve that it was supposed to be. And then some more finish sanding, and that part of the hatch issue was resolved. To reestablish the lost rivet lines, I duplicated them on a piece of masking tape so I could flip it to the other side and make sure they were all spaced the same. Okay, finally we're at the point where we can start painting. Before I start appreciating with some thin black Testors enamel, I did wipe everything down with some isopropyl rubbing alcohol and blew everything off with about 15 psi, and then used a tack cloth and came back and made sure everything was lint free, super clean, and ready to go. So again, with some thinned Testors flat black enamel, I reduced it about 50% with some base coat reducer. I'll show a shot of that can later on when I used the same base coat reducer throughout for the different colors. And it works with the Testors enamel. I've done some test sprays with it. It's a lot less expensive than buying specific thinners for this stuff. I like it better than the mineral spirits. Seems to be a cleaner cut, and it also is a slower drying thinner, so it allows the enamels to actually bite into the plastic. So I don't have any problems with the lifting up when I mask up, like the Splinter camo, for example. You don't have that issue where it would lift away. Bites into the plastic really well with that enamel base coat reducer. Also, I've got the landing gear masked up so I can do the wheels separate, because there's rubber wheels that go on over the top of the plastic. So I wanted, that's something I don't have to mask, so just go ahead and paint it, get it out of the way. But running about 15 psi, I don't know if I mentioned that before, on the pre-shade here. It's a pretty low air pressure setting. I usually don't look at the actual pressures. I just like to throw it out there in case somebody's trying to replicate what I'm doing. I do everything by ear. I've been painting so long, I don't even look at the gauge. I can tell right away just from the sound if it's within range of where I need to be at. And then I just go back around and try to get as close as I can to the panel lines on. There's not a lot of panel lines on this due to the nature of the materials used. So it's a pretty simple pre-shade on this particular build. In fact, you honestly won't see a whole lot of it after the initial splinters camos put on the top. It will show a lot better on the bottom, where it's just that RLM 76 blue that's on there. But yeah, on to the more fun part of the build and getting this thing painted up, get to a final assembly. Alright, pre-shades out of the way, on to some Mr. Color enamel RLM 76 with a 1370 automotive base coat reducer. Doing about a 50% reduction on this. The bottle was about half empty, so I went ahead and topped it up. Seems to flow really good at that mix ratio with this particular setup. Again, using about 15 psi on the gun. It will vary. The hose expands a little bit. I need to remedy that. I'm having to adjust as I'm spraying because I'm losing and gaining pressure there a little bit. So that's a flaw in the setup that I have to work around, but I'm aware of it, so it's not a big issue. Just have to pay attention to what's going on with the pressures. Okay, on to the first of the splinter camo colors, and this is going to be an RLM 81. Bear in mind, I'm not doing a replica of a full-scale aircraft. This is a copy of an RC aircraft, so the colors aren't going to be quite the same as they would be for, like, if you were doing an actual RLM dyed-in-the-wool in the field type Me163. So we're taking a little bit of artistic license with the camo splinter layout to match the customer's build that we're modeling it after. So just kind of bear that in mind. I know some of the rivet counters would be going crazy about right now. They're going, that's not correct. But we're just replicating an RC version. So if you're watching this and want to replicate an authentic Me163, do a little research and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But the pattern itself is correct. Again, spraying about 15 psi. Again, about a 50% reduction on this is actual Model Master enamel instead of the Mr. Color that we used on the bottom. And with the first color down, time to mask up for the final color. Again, same Model Master enamel, about a 50% reduction. I go a little easier on the pressure here just because I don't want to blow up underneath the mask. Also, it helps if you shoot away from the edge of the mask so you're not blowing your color up underneath. I do a very light, just a mist coat on the first one and then come back in and fill it in with some heavier applications. Usually 2 to 3 coats is all that's required. And once the final color set up and dried, it was time to unmask. Pretty straightforward process, nothing fancy here. Just I try to pull away from the actual edges, so instead of just randomly tearing the tape off, I try to, as gently as I can, and pull up and away from the masked area, and try not to pull the tape into the previously applied color. If you are going to have an issue with the paint lifting, that's usually what will cause it, is if you pull the tape off into that direction. So a good rule of thumb is to pull it 45 away from the area that was masked. Now, my apologies for this being a little out of sequence, but before the mask was pulled, I did come back in and put the modeling on the tail. I took the top color and thinned it 75% and cut the pressure down to about probably 12 to 10 psi, and just very gently with little pulls on the trigger, give it a little, get up real close It's best to practice this on a piece of scrap so you know exactly what your airbrush is going to do and how fine you can get the nozzle to work. Having to paint the white on the nose, there's also a very, very thin black band that went around in between the white and the splinter camo. I painted the white first, and then using a reverse mask, I masked the splinter section off, and then with some cut down fine line, established that I think it's probably a 32nd of a gap around there, and then just came back and sprayed it with some black enamel. As far as weathering on this aircraft, they were pretty well tended to. It's not going to get real beat up. I took 3 shades of artist oils and set them out on a cardboard pallet, let the oil drain off of them for a little bit, and then what I like to do is use 3 separate containers of mineral spirits. This is the odorless, and then I have one where I can mix the different pigments in, usually a smaller one like the beer cap you see here. And then I have the 2 other caps that are just pure thinner. That's all they are, is the odorless. So I can wet the area down where I'm going to apply the actual wash before I actually hit it with artist oil, so that helps it disperse through the actual recessed panel lines. Also, as a note, I forgot to mention that I did seal this down 2 days before this with some Testor's dull coat and let it completely cure out for 2 days. I found in the past that if I get too aggressive with these oil washes and I haven't let the dull coat completely cure out, it will lift it if I get too aggressive. It's not a big issue if I'm not really doing large areas like this. There's just very small little pin wash areas that I'll be doing, because obviously there's not a lot of panel lines on this aircraft, and like I said, I'm keeping the weathering down to a basic minimum. Up underneath the fuselage where the main gear is, I did take a little bit more of a earth color instead of the black, just to give it a little bit of a like stain appearance, because it would have thrown up some grass and it would have hit the bottom of the fuse in those areas. Because of the nature of the way these aircraft were fueled, they basically got a bath every time they got fueled up, for the nature of the C stop and the T stop. We'll talk about that later. But just a basic application of a pin wash, and then after it sets on there for a little bit, I come back with the different clear caps and clean up the excess. Pretty straightforward process. I'm sure most of you modelers have seen this before. Didn't want to do too deep of a dive into it and bore everybody, but this is just how I do it. But a final decal session, all the little tiny placards and all that were put into place. I used some Mr. Decal Softer and Setter. Those products seem to work really well for me, especially going over a dull coat finish. After the decals had completely dried out for a day, I then took some Testor's dull coat, reduced it 50% with some of that same base reducer that I used on the enamel. Gave the whole aircraft about 2 good coats of the dull coat and let that flash off. Everything seemed to cover pretty good, and I was real happy with the way the dull coat laid out on it. Didn't have any dry spots, didn't have it balling up. Sometimes if your pressure's too high, you'll have a problem with the paint balling up and forming these little crystal balls. There'll be a white, tiny, almost a sandy grain. If that happens, you're spraying too dry. It's a dry spray that you're getting. Try to get the nozzle a little closer, maybe turn your pressure down a little bit. Using this particular type of reducer seems to help that, because it's a very slow reducer, so it doesn't flash off very quick. It gives me a little more work time. But that was it. The basic dull coat finished up, and she's ready for final assembly. The pitot tube, antennas, and the little spinny thing on the bit on the front. That's actually a wind generator, that little tiny propeller on the front of it. Well, in conclusion, the Meng Me163 Comet kit is a nice kit. I could not recommend this to a beginner. You're definitely going to need a little more advanced skills to deal with some of the gaps and the fit issues. But the mold, the lines, the detail is all fine. It's a nice kit. I'm not going to beat up on it because of the few fit issues that it had. And it certainly looks the part. I did enjoy it in spite of the struggles I had with a few fit issues. And all in all, it turns out to make a really good representation of the Me163 Comet.
Takes off. That dolly was dropped. If they dropped it too soon, the dolly would bounce back up, hit the bottom of the airplane, and it would crash. They could not exactly. He's going to make a low pass with a smoke system on. The two fuels were what are called hyperbolic. As soon as they touched each other in the combustion chamber, they would go off. The idea of getting the plane up quickly was a dismal failure because they had to put one fuel in, wash the plane down, and then put in the second fuel. And even then there were occasions when they mixed on the ground and everything went boom. 3 on one occasion. That was a nice air-long roll. And when she landed, she broke her back.
So when they wear out, I do.
There is one of these in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. There is one of these in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. And nobody is flying one anywhere in the world. That private airplane was thinking, when he was looking down and seeing this. And it does require a special waiver from the Academy of Aeronautics to fly turbines.
They're only on there with Velcro. It really got bad.
Beautiful, smooth landing. Give him a round.
They've gotten shorter.
Well, thanks for watching. Please hit that like button and subscribe. And I hope y'all enjoyed the video. Y'all be good to each other, and we'll see you on the next one.